Renata Fletcher sat in her modest kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock filling the silence that had long since become her constant companion. She stared at the old, cracked phone in her hands, her knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. The anticipation, the nervous flutter that had accompanied her every thought about her son's life for decades, was replaced by a heavy, crushing weight of dread. She had called Max, her only son, simply to ask a harmless question. When will your wedding take place? But the response that came from the other end was anything but harmless. Lena, Max's new wife, the woman Renata had helped raise from an uncertain young girl into a polished, sophisticated adult, looked her directly in the eyes with a smile that was both beautiful and terrifying. "Oh, we already got married yesterday," she said, voice laced with a chilling delight. "We only invited special people." The words hit Renata like a bolt of ice through her veins. Special people. She, who had spent years ensuring Max and Lena had everything they could ever want or need. She, who had covered $500 monthly rent for them without complaint, bought every piece of furniture for their small apartment, and filled their refrigerator when it sat empty. She, who had sacrificed her own desires, her own comfort, her own dreams, so that the lives of others could shine. And now, she was not special, not even close. The kitchen seemed smaller, the walls closing in, as she stood there with the phone pressed to her ear, as if it were a physical weight capable of breaking her. Max avoided her gaze, shifting nervously in his chair, while Lena stretched languidly on the sofa Renata herself had purchased. The pale lavender dress she had painstakingly selected for this wedding hung uselessly in her closet, accompanied by matching shoes and a clutch that would never be carried. A wedding she had envisioned herself part of, planning every detail for weeks, was nothing more than a private secret she was excluded from. Renata sank into the chair at the kitchen table, her mind replaying every sacrifice she had made over the past 3 years. $200 for the dress. Hundreds more on gifts, on meals, on little comforts that she imagined would build a bridge between herself and the happiness of her family. She had called her sister in Chicago to share the excitement. She had cleaned her house meticulously, thinking, maybe, just maybe, they might come celebrate with her afterward. Every plan, every hope, every ounce of expectation shattered in a single poison-laced phrase. Only special people. Max finally spoke, his voice artificially calm, rehearsed like a line from a poorly memorized play. "Mom, it was very small, just the two of us and the witnesses." Renata knew better. She had already seen the social media photos. Lena's parents smiling proudly beside the newlyweds. Her siblings raising champagne glasses in celebration. Lena's white dress, which Renata had helped pay for with an $800 contribution she had given for her personal expenses. Every image was a dagger in her chest, proof of the world she had been barred from. A week later, 7 days to the hour of that initial humiliation, the phone rang again. Lena's voice had changed. Gone was the confident, haughty woman who had deliberately excluded her. Now, the tone was pleading, desperate. "Renata, the rent is overdue," she said, trembling slightly, as if the universe itself were crumbling. "If we don't pay this week, we'll be evicted. You forgot to make the transfer." Renata's silence stretched across the phone line, heavy and deliberate. She recalled every trip to the bank she had made for them, every canceled plan, every meal she had skipped so they could have a little more. And now, after they had shamelessly cut her out of the most sacred moment of their lives. They called as if nothing had happened. "Lena," she said softly, her calm a weapon honed over decades. "Didn't I tell you I only help special people?" Silence. Then a stammering whisper. "Renata, I don't understand. We were always special to you. You're like a second mother." Lies. All lies. Words draped in the sweetness they had only ever used when extracting something from her. A same tone that had coaxed money for the wedding dress, for the honeymoon, for the rings, all financed without her ever attending a single moment of their celebration. For years, she had walked on eggshells, every gesture, every word weighed in a meticulous balance of fear and hope. She had been the perfect mother, the obliging mother-in-law, the silent benefactor whose presence was taken for granted, until now. The realization burned like fire. She calculated the numbers quietly, almost ritualistically. Rent, $500 a month, over 36 months, $18,000. Food and supplies, $200 a month, $7,200. Gifts and celebrations, $3,000. Medical expenses, $800. Unreturned car loans, $2,500. Furniture, $1,200. Added all together, $33,400 she had given freely from her own retirement, from money set aside for decades, all thrown at people who had treated her as invisible. Renata sat on her bed that night and cried, not tears of sorrow, but of anger, of accumulated humiliation and frustration. She cried for the years she had lost herself, for the unconditional love that had been mistaken for weakness, for the generosity that had been exploited. She cried for the woman who had been trampled in silence, for the mother who had been forgotten at her son's wedding, for the person she had almost ceased to be. Mourning brought no relief, only clarity. She stared into the mirror, the reflection of tired eyes, lined with age and care, staring back at her. But beneath the familiar gaze was something new. Hardness, determination, the dormant resolve of a woman, finally awakened. The coffee she made that morning was not for Max, not for Lena, not for anyone else. It was for herself. Today, for the first time in decades, she would be her own priority. At the table, she laid out checkbooks, bank statements, and receipts. Every transaction, every gift, every sacrifice meticulously reviewed. She calculated the exact sum of her devotion, her blind generosity, her misplaced trust. $33,400. It was more than money. It was her life's energy, her care, her endless giving. And now, it would be reclaimed. The phone rang again, once, twice, 3 times. Max's name flashed on the screen. She let it ring. Lena called next. She let it ring. A text from Max. "Mom, please answer. We need to talk." She deleted it without hesitation. For the first time, Renata stepped outside without purpose. No bank visits, no errands for others' needs. Just a walk. Past the park where she had once played with Max as a child. She remembered the boy who had hugged her tight, claiming she was the best mom in the world. That boy was gone. In his place was a man who confused love with convenience, affection with financial dependency. At the bank, she halted in front of the familiar glass doors. Mr. Klein, the branch manager who had watched her generosity unfold for years, waved. She walked directly to his office. "Mr. Klein," she said firmly, "I want to cancel all automatic transfers. I no longer want anyone accessing my accounts." His concern was genuine, more genuine than Max or Lena had shown in years. "Are you sure, Mrs. Fletcher?" he asked, the tone carefully neutral. "Yes, I finally opened my eyes, she replied. While Mr. Klein processed the changes, the phone did not stop ringing. She turned it off completely. When he handed her the papers, his words touched her. I hope you're not under pressure, he said softly. I'm not. I'm finally free, she whispered. The morning sun streamed through the half-open blinds, casting long streaks of light across the living room where Renata had spent decades creating memories for a family that now seemed to have forgotten her existence. The coffee she had brewed still steamed gently in her mug, filling the room with the comforting aroma she had always associated with calm and reflection. But today, there was no peace in that aroma, only a subtle reminder of the life she had allowed herself to be drained by, the energy she had given freely to people who would never appreciate it. Renata sat at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of the bank statements she had meticulously arranged the night before. Each line, each transaction, was a testament not only to her financial generosity, but also to her unwavering hope that love could be bought, or at least secured, through acts of sacrifice. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memory of that cold, rehearsed smile from Lena and the dismissive glance from Max pierce through her. The betrayal still stung, but the anger that surged within her now felt electric, alive, and necessary. She stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. No more. This was the thought that had crystallized in her mind, sharp and unforgiving. For years, she had been an invisible foundation, the silent provider who had given everything without asking for anything in return. Today, she would no longer be invisible. Today, she would take control, not with impulsive rage, but with the careful, deliberate precision that had always defined her life. Her first task was to secure her home. She called the locksmith she had used years ago and arranged for all locks to be changed immediately. Every door, every window, every possible entry point would now be under her control. She knew Max and Lena had keys, but the illusion of trust was over. From now on, her home would be hers alone, a sanctuary where she could exist without fear of intrusion. While the locksmith worked, Renata decided it was time to confront the legal threat. The call to Mr. Weber, the elderly rights attorney she had known for decades, was swift. His voice was calm, professional, yet carried an undertone of concern. Renata, I understand the situation, he said. What your children attempted yesterday is more common than you might think. It falls under elder financial abuse. Their actions, including unauthorized access to your private documents, could have serious legal consequences. Renata listened intently, the simmering rage inside her tempered by a methodical calm. I want everything documented, she instructed. Every transfer, every request, every intrusion. I will not be manipulated or intimidated, ever again. Hours passed as Mr. Weber and Renata reviewed every financial transaction, every gift, every expense she had covered for Max and Lena. When the final tally was complete, her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she had endured. $33,400. Money she had taken from her own savings, her retirement fund, her late husband's inheritance, all lavished on adults who had treated her as a nonentity. I should have seen it sooner, she whispered to herself, the words barely audible. I should have known that love cannot be forced with money, that kindness without boundaries is a dangerous gift. By the late afternoon, Renata returned home, the new locks secure, the security system installed, and her mind sharpened with purpose. But as she approached her front door, 3 cars were parked where only one should have been. Her heart skipped a beat, not with fear this time, but with the icy clarity of anticipation. They had breached her sanctuary. She opened the door slowly, deliberately, and was greeted by a scene that froze her momentarily. Max seated on her sofa, head in his hands. Lena pacing restlessly, a thin veil of panic replacing her usual confident demeanor. And an older man she did not recognize rifling through papers on her dining table. Documents, bank statements, private letters, all splayed carelessly across the surface. "What is happening here?" she asked, her voice low but carrying an unmistakable steel edge. They froze. Lita was the first to speak, her voice dripping with a desperate urgency that had been absent in her call a week earlier. "Renata, thank God you're here. We need to talk. This is Mr. Fisher from the law firm." Renata's eyes narrowed. "My situation?" she asked, deliberately calm, as she walked past them and gathered her papers into a neat stack. Max lifted his head, his expression a mix of panic and entitlement. "Mom, they told us you canceled all the transfers. We don't understand why." Mr. Fisher, a man in his 50s with a polished gray suit and a smile that did not reach his eyes, extended a hand. "Mrs. Fletcher, I am Dr. Fisher. Your children are concerned about your mental state and have requested that we assess your capacity to manage your finances." Renata did not shake his hand. Instead, she held her documents tightly, her spine straight and unyielding. "These are my private papers," she said. "You have no right to touch them. You have no right to be here without my consent." Max attempted to intervene, his voice laden with that familiar condescending tone. "Mom, we're worried about you. Your behavior has been unusual. First, you cut us off financially without explanation. Then, you ignore our calls. We think maybe you need professional help." Renata felt a surge of controlled fury. Lena stepped forward, feigning concern, attempting to place a hand on hers. "Renata, darling, we know it's stressful. Perhaps the loneliness is affecting you. At your age, confusion is normal." The word confusion hit her like a physical blow. Now she understood the game. The lawyer, the frantic appeals, the manipulation, all designed to strip her of autonomy, to declare her incapable so they could seize control of her assets. The same people who had excluded her from her son's wedding now tried to paint her as senile, helpless, irrational. "I am not confused," she said, her voice firm, sharp, unwavering. "I am clearer than I have been in decades. You will leave my house immediately." Mr. Fisher tried to reason, employing the professional, measured tone of a lawyer accustomed to negotiations. "Mrs. Fletcher, we understand, but your children have a right to intervene if they believe your financial decisions are impaired. There are documented behaviors of concern." Renata laughed, low and bitter. "Concern? The concern is yours, not mine. The only impairment here is the audacity of people who think they can claim what is mine, that my life and money are theirs to command." Lena's eyes widened, a mixture of fear and fury, as she realized the woman before her was no longer pliant, no longer the obedient provider she had exploited for years. "We never treated you badly. Your family. All you have will belong to us anyway. We're just speeding up the process." Renata's jaw tightened. "Everything you expect to inherit will happen on my terms, not yours. Out." Now. Max rose, face contorted in frustration, anger, and entitlement. "Mom, you can't just. We have obligations. Rent, car payments, credit cards you co-signed. You can't cut us off overnight." Her voice rose for the first time, not in desperation, but in command. "Who says I can't? I have spent decades funding lives that do not respect me. I will not continue. You are out. All three of you. Now. Fisher tried once more, offering legal papers, power of attorney forms, any mechanism to regain control. She took the folder and, without even glancing, hurled it into the trash. The room went silent, except for the shallow breaths of the three who had so recently believed they controlled her. Lena's tears were not of sorrow, but frustration, anger at the loss of control. Max tried to approach, pleading, reasoning, but she stepped back, her boundaries impenetrable. I am already alone, she said quietly, with a calm that carried more power than anger. And it is by choice, not by neglect. Leave. One by one they exited, wounded, confused, and utterly powerless against a woman who had finally remembered her own worth. Renata closed the door behind them, listening to the echoing silence, the most beautiful sound she had heard in years. It was a silence of freedom, a silence of reclaimed power. And yet, as she sank into her armchair, she knew the battle was only beginning. This was the first confrontation, the first declaration that she was no longer a passive participant in a life that had taken her for granted. Tomorrow, she would act with even greater precision. The war had begun, and she would fight it not with emotion, but with intelligence, strategy, and a resolve forged from years of betrayal. The following morning, the air in Renata Fletcher's home felt different. It was heavier with purpose, yet lighter with the knowledge that she was no longer at the mercy of anyone's whims. The previous day's confrontation had been a revelation, a painful but necessary awakening. She had seen the true faces of her son and his wife, the raw hunger for control beneath their polite masks. Today, there would be no compromises. Renata moved methodically, her every step deliberate. First, she tackled the physical space of her home. The locksmith arrived promptly, a silent professional whose hands moved expertly, changing locks on every door, installing deadbolts, and ensuring that every potential point of entry was secure. Windows were reinforced with secondary locks, and the security system was installed in record time. Cameras now silently monitored every entrance, every hallway, and even the driveway. This house, once a place where she felt the burden of others' entitlement pressing down upon her, was now a fortress. Her fortress. Next came the financial fortification. She visited her bank, the one she had relied on for decades, and opened a new account in her name alone, severing any lingering connections Max or Lena might have had. Mr. Klein assisted her quietly, his professionalism a balm to the years of manipulation and stress she had endured. Renata's meticulous nature surfaced once more as she went through every transaction in her mind. Automatic transfers canceled, joint accounts closed, and new safeguards put in place to ensure her independence would never again be threatened. As she walked home, a strange mix of exhilaration and apprehension coursed through her veins. She had never experienced this kind of power before, not over others, but over her own life. For decades, she had placed the happiness and convenience of her family above her own. Every meal cooked, every dollar spent, every sleepless night had been an offering she thought was necessary for love. Now, for the first time, she realized that love could never be bought, and the realization, though bitter, was liberating. Upon returning home, Renata found her sanctuary quiet. The only sounds were the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. She sank into her favorite chair, reviewing her plan mentally. The confrontation yesterday had been a mere opening salvo. Max and Lena would not accept their sudden loss of control easily. They would try again, in any form, subtle or overt. She had to be prepared. Hours later, a subtle vibration against her phone alerted her to a message. Max. Mom, please. Let's talk. We can make this right. She didn't reply. Instead, she made notes. Every contact, every message, every attempted intrusion would be recorded and catalogued. Mr. Weber had advised her meticulously. Documentation was the most potent weapon against attempts to manipulate or threaten her autonomy. The day stretched onward. Renata's mind wandered through memories, old and painful, each one a reminder of what she had endured. Max's childhood, once filled with laughter and innocent mischief, now seemed tainted by the greed he had carried into adulthood. Lena's transformation from a vulnerable, dependent girl into a confident, manipulative woman was stark in retrospect. Yet Renata realized that none of this was her fault. She had loved deeply, perhaps too deeply, but she had never been weak. Weakness was a lie she had told herself to survive the constant demands of others. Evening fell, and with it came the inevitable escalation. Max and Lena, frustrated by their sudden loss of control, tried a new tactic. They called repeatedly, their messages growing more desperate, their tone subtly threatening. Mom, this is unfair. You're overreacting. You're hurting yourself. Renata remained unmoved. She had rehearsed this in her mind countless times, and nothing they said could breach the armor she had now forged. Then came the unexpected visitor. A car idled outside, unfamiliar yet purposeful. Renata watched silently from her kitchen window. Two figures emerged, Max, of course, and a man she did not recognize, their expressions carefully masked, but revealing thin streaks of frustration. Lena was conspicuously absent, perhaps orchestrating from afar. Renata exhaled slowly. Perfect. Let's see how bold you are when the walls are mine. She approached the front door, unlocked it with the new key, and greeted them calmly. Her posture was upright, unwavering, her eyes clear and calculating. "What brings you here?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth, but full of authority. Max shifted uncomfortably. "Mom, we just want to talk. Please." Renata smiled faintly, not the warmth of affection, but the satisfaction of control regained. "You can talk all you want," she said, stepping aside. "But you will respect my rules. No entering my home without invitation. No touching my documents. And no attempting to access my accounts. Do you understand?" They hesitated, and she saw the panic flicker in Max's eyes. It was the first real sign of fear she had witnessed since this ordeal began. Renata knew she had them where she wanted them, not through intimidation, but through undeniable clarity of boundaries. Inside, she offered no seats, no gestures of comfort. She stood at the kitchen island, reviewing her mental checklist. Every legal safeguard, every financial boundary, every camera, every lock, all meticulously planned and now in place. Her home was her domain, her life her own, and nothing Max or Lena could say or do would reverse that. Max tried to speak again, but she held up a hand. "I will listen, but only facts. Excuses, manipulations, emotional appeals, they fall on deaf ears. You had your chance, and you chose exclusion over inclusion, manipulation over respect. Now, everything is different." The man with him, presumably a legal consultant or advisor, attempted to intervene, but Renata's gaze met his. The unspoken message was clear. "No one here commands me. Not through law, not through guilt, not through relationship." She had survived decades of exploitation. She would not bow now. As they left, defeated yet plotting, Renata knew this was only the beginning. Every step she had taken, the locks, the bank safeguards, the documentation, was part of a larger plan. She was no longer reactive. She was strategic. The war, as she had begun to call it in her mind, was just entering its first active phase. That night, she sat in the quiet, the silence of her home filled with the soft creaks and groans of the house settling. Renata poured herself a glass of wine, a luxury she had rarely allowed herself, and reflected. For decades, she had given everything to secure the happiness of others. Now she gave to herself. Every dollar, every moment, every ounce of her energy would belong solely to her, and she realized something vital. They could threaten, they could beg, they could manipulate, but the power she had reclaimed could never be stolen again. Renata Fletcher smiled faintly, a cold, determined smile. Tomorrow, she would take the next steps. More than locks, more than security, more than legal safeguards, she would reclaim every ounce of dignity and autonomy that had been stripped from her over decades. The fortress was complete, and its walls would not be breached. Not by fear, not by guilt, not by anyone. The next morning, the sun rose gently over Renata Fletcher's house, but inside the atmosphere crackled with a quiet intensity. Unlike any other morning in the past decades, she did not wake with anxiety over Max or Lena's whims. Today, she awoke with a plan, a meticulously designed strategy that would ensure she could never again be exploited. Renata started with her legal countermeasures. She called Mr. Weber, and together they prepared a complete record of the past 3 years, all financial transactions, gifts, transfers, and communications. Each detail was carefully documented, with dates, amounts, and context. The pile of evidence grew enormous, a tangible testament to decades of relentless giving, manipulation, and betrayal. Mr. Weber looked at her once and said, "Renata, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of financial exploitation I have seen. Legally, you are untouchable, but it's the psychological statement that will truly impact them." Renata smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edge of her documents. She had anticipated every move Max and Lena could make. Threats, guilt, manipulation. But she had also anticipated their panic when confronted with undeniable truth. This was no longer about money alone. It was about reclaiming her life. By late morning, she began to execute the first stage of her counterstrike. She sent formal letters to Max and Lena, outlining the exact terms of her financial and personal boundaries. Every word was precise, every sentence deliberate. No room for misinterpretation. No chance for emotional pleading to sway her. She included documentation summaries, the security upgrades she had implemented, and a clear warning. Unauthorized attempts to access her home or finances would have immediate legal consequences. Shortly after sending the letters, she received a call. Max's voice was tight, controlled, yet laced with the thinly veiled panic she had been waiting for. "Mom, why are you doing this? It's too much. We didn't mean." Renata listened, her expression calm but unwavering. "You had every chance to act with respect and honesty," she said, her voice measured. "You chose deceit, exclusion, and entitlement. Now the consequences are yours to face. I am done being manipulated, done being taken for granted, done being invisible." The conversation ended swiftly. Max deflated, his voice fading into silence. Lena did not call. Her pride and desperation collided in a paralysis of uncertainty. Renata knew their psychological manipulation had failed. For the first time, they realized that the woman they had treated as pliable and submissive was no longer theirs to control. By afternoon, Renata turned her attention to personal empowerment. She had always deferred her own desires, travels unplanned, hobbies abandoned, friendships neglected. But today, she began reclaiming them. She booked a small weekend trip to the mountains, a place she had loved in her youth, but had abandoned for decades to care for others. She arranged visits with old friends she hadn't seen in years, and she took a class she had always wanted to join, painting. Each act was a declaration, a reclaiming of the life that had been paused, muted, and manipulated by her own family's greed. The first ripple of true impact came that evening. Max and Lena appeared at her front door again, but this time, their approach was hesitant, guarded, almost fearful. Renata greeted them calmly, observing the tension in their posture. They tried to speak, to appeal, to charm, but the fortress she had built, both legally and emotionally, was impenetrable. Max attempted to assert authority, his tone tinged with frustration. "Mom, you're going too far. This is extreme. We're family. You can't just..." Renata cut him off with a steady hand. "You cannot claim what is mine. You cannot dictate my life. I am not your ATM. I am not a servant. I am not invisible. And this house, these finances, this life, are mine to protect and enjoy." The words hit harder than any financial calculation could. For the first time, Max and Lena realized that their emotional leverage, the subtle and overt pressures they had used for years, was null. Renata's independence was absolute, her clarity undeniable. As the evening progressed, Renata sat in her chair, reviewing her plan for the coming weeks. Every potential move from Max and Lena had been anticipated. She had legal safeguards in place, security measures complete, and personal empowerment firmly established. Their manipulation could no longer touch her. And yet, she allowed herself a quiet moment of reflection, not of sadness, not of anger, but of relief. She had spent decades giving to others at the expense of herself. Now, for the first time, she was receiving the most important gift of all: autonomy, respect, and the unshakable knowledge that no one could ever control her again. Renata Fletcher smiled faintly, her eyes cold, clear, and determined. The war had entered a new phase, not one of chaos, but of precision. Max and Lena would learn, slowly, painfully, and irrevocably, that the woman they had tried to manipulate was no longer available for exploitation. Tonight, she went to bed with a sense of quiet triumph, not of vengeance, but of reclamation. The fortress was not just walls and locks, it was her mind, her body, her heart, and her life. And nothing, no person, no plea, no manipulation could ever breach it again. Renata Fletcher had never felt so alive. The air in her home carried a charged silence, the kind that heralds the shift of power. Every lock installed, every camera positioned, every bank account secured, was a calculated step toward reclaiming not just her property, but her dignity, her freedom, her life. She had moved past the fear, the manipulation, and the guilt that had defined decades of her existence. Now, it was time to act, not in haste, not in anger, but with precision, intelligence, and an unwavering sense of justice. Her first task was observation. She had learned over the years that knowledge was the ultimate weapon. Max and Lena, like all manipulators, had predictable patterns, subtle weaknesses, masked by arrogance and desperation. She began documenting their schedules, their interactions, their subtle attempts to regain influence. Every call ignored, every visit met with measured boundaries was a lesson in control, teaching them, slowly, that their previous tactics no longer worked. By mid-morning, she began implementing her most daring plan yet, the psychological reclamation. Max had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to manipulate situations to his advantage. Lena had relied on charm and calculated urgency, but both had underestimated the depth of Renata's patience, intelligence, and sheer resolve. She began sending carefully crafted letters and emails, not accusatory, not emotional, but factual, detailed, and precise, documenting every instance of financial reliance, deception, and breach of trust. Each document was meticulously formatted, evidence-backed, and professional, a testament to decades of manipulation laid bare. As these messages reached Max and Lena, Renata could observe the subtle ripples of unease. They had assumed compliance, submission, and fear would remain constants in their relationship with her. They had been wrong. For the first time, their world of comfortable exploitation had been destabilized. Meanwhile, Renata turned her attention inward. For decades, she had deferred her own desires. Vacations she had postponed. Hobbies she had abandoned. Friendships neglected. Everything had been sacrificed for Max and Lena's comfort. Now, she booked trips she had only dreamed of, reconnected with friends who had silently watched her struggles, and took up the arts, learning to paint and express herself in colors and forms she had never allowed herself to explore. Each brushstroke, each laugh shared with old companions, was a reclamation of life lost, a declaration of independence realized. The next stage of her strategy involved controlled confrontation. Renata knew the moment Max and Lena would attempt to breach her boundaries would come. They always did when deprived of control. She was prepared. She reinforced her security measures, ensured her legal counsel was on standby, and mentally rehearsed every possible scenario. The encounter would not be emotional. It would be strategic, measured, and impactful. Predictably, Max and Lena appeared at her door days later. The familiar sense of entitlement radiated from them, but now it was tinged with uncertainty. They had begun to sense the shift, but did not yet fully grasp its magnitude. Renata greeted them calmly, standing tall, her posture a symbol of unshakable authority. "Mom, we need to talk," Max said, attempting to mask frustration with forced calm. Renata's gaze was unwavering. "We will talk," she replied, "but only on my terms, with respect to the boundaries I have established. You will not enter my home uninvited. You will not attempt to access my finances, and you will not manipulate or deceive. Do you understand?" The tension was palpable. Max and Lena exchanged a fleeting glance, desperation masked by arrogance. This was the first true confrontation where they realized that their previous strategies were obsolete. Inside, Renata continued, "For decades, I gave freely, not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed in family. I believed in love. You took advantage of that trust. You treated my generosity as an entitlement, my care as a weakness, and my presence as optional. That stops today." Max tried to interject, his voice raising. "Mom, you're being unreasonable. We didn't." Renata cut him off with deliberate precision. "Unreasonable? No. I am clear, deliberate, and justified. Every demand you made, every expectation, every manipulation, it ends now. I will no longer fund a life that disregards my dignity. I will no longer endure disrespect disguised as familial affection. Understand this. My generosity is not a right you can claim. It is a privilege, and you forfeited it with your deceit." Lena attempted her signature tactic, a soft, pleading voice, feigning remorse. "Renata, please, we're family. You can't." Renata's eyes narrowed. Family is respect, trust, and reciprocity. You have shown none of these. I will not be complicit in your exploitation any longer. The psychological impact was immediate. Max's confident facade cracked. Lena's charm faltered. They realized that the woman they had treated as submissive, pliable, and endlessly forgiving was gone. In her place stood a figure of resolve, clarity, and strategic intelligence. Renata did not stop at words. She enacted further measures to solidify her independence. She contacted a trusted financial advisor to restructure her investments, ensuring complete control and oversight. She retained a legal team to review potential threats, creating a barrier against future attempts at coercion or deception. Every phone call, every message, every visit was now cataloged, reviewed, and countered with precision. Over the next weeks, Renata's life shifted dramatically. She traveled to the mountains, painting landscapes that captured the serenity she had long denied herself. She met friends for long lunches, sharing laughter and memories, reconnecting with the world she had paused for others. Each day, she felt lighter, freer, more alive. Her home was secure, her finances untouchable, and her dignity restored. Max and Lena, meanwhile, faced the consequences of underestimating her resolve. Their attempts at manipulation were met with calm, factual rebuttals. Their desperation grew, but so did Renata's strength. Each encounter, verbal, written, or physical, was a calculated exposure of their reliance on deceit and entitlement. They could threaten, plead, and manipulate, but nothing penetrated the fortress she had built, mentally, emotionally, and legally. Renata Fletcher had transformed. From the woman who had once measured love in dollars, sacrifices, and quiet submission, she had become a strategist, a guardian of her own life, a force of deliberate justice. Every act of kindness would now be a choice, every interaction a conscious engagement, every investment a personal decision. No longer invisible, no longer exploited, no longer subordinate, she was the architect of her destiny. As Part 5 closes, Renata sits in her home, surrounded by the fruits of her liberation. Secure finances, a fortified home, friendships rekindled, and a life reclaimed. She smiles, not with malice, but with quiet triumph. Max and Lena, who had treated her generosity as a tool for their convenience, now face a reality they did not anticipate. The woman they sought to manipulate is now untouchable, unyielding, and fully autonomous, and she knows this is only the beginning. The night was heavy, draped in silence except for the distant hum of crickets and the soft clinking of chains swinging from the barn ceiling. Eleanor sat at her desk, the dim lamplight throwing shadows across the old parchment. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed the pen against the paper. Every word she wrote was laced with decades of hurt, rage, and the kind of love that turns into poison when betrayed. To the man I once believed I was building eternity with. She paused, staring at the first line, feeling her throat tighten. The ink bled slightly into the fibers of the old letter paper, spreading like the cracks in her own heart. Eleanor wrote for hours. Every secret Henry had buried, she unearthed. Every lie he told, she exposed with surgical precision. The letter was not meant to be read by Henry alone. It was for the world that saw her as the quiet, naive wife. The letter would find its way into the hands of everyone who mattered: the investors, the family, the church, even the judge Henry bribed years ago. By dawn, Eleanor sealed the envelope with a wax stamp, the same emblem that once symbolized their union, two intertwined initials, E and H. She pressed the stamp against the wax and whispered softly, "Now it stands for the end." That morning, Henry woke up to a house that no longer felt like his own. The servants avoided his eyes, their silence loud with judgment. On the breakfast table lay the envelope, resting atop his untouched coffee cup. He recognized the seal instantly. His pulse raced. When he tore it open and began to read, the color drained from his face. Each word was a blade. Eleanor had laid bare his secrets, his embezzlement of her dowry, the illegal deeds he transferred to his mistress, the lies he built his business empire upon. Every sentence was evidence, meticulously documented and cross-referenced with accounts and signatures. But it wasn't just facts. It was confession. The story of a woman who loved too deeply, who forgave too easily, and who finally chose to burn everything rather than live in silence. Henry crushed the letter in his fist, his knuckles white. "She wouldn't dare," he muttered, but his voice cracked under the weight of disbelief. He stormed out, searching for her. But Eleanor wasn't home. The staff told him she left before dawn, dressed in her late mother's mourning black, carrying only one suitcase and a small wooden box. Inside that box was his empire's future. Meanwhile, miles away in the countryside, Eleanor sat in the back of a train compartment, her reflection ghostly in the window. She watched the golden fields pass by, her mind replaying everything. The laughter, the betrayal, the years she wasted trying to be enough. Sitting across from her was Margaret, her childhood friend, the only one who had believed her all along. "You really did it, didn't you?" Margaret said softly. "You burned him." "No," Eleanor replied, her eyes still fixed on the passing horizon. "I just told the truth. Fire will take care of the rest." Margaret studied her friend, the calmness in her tone, the quiet fury beneath. "And where will you go now?" Eleanor turned her gaze back to her. "Home, to where I should have stayed when I still had a heart." By the time Henry reached his office, chaos had erupted. The letter had already made its rounds. His business partners were furious, lawyers were waiting, and the press had begun circling like vultures. He tried to make calls, but one by one, his lines went dead. The empire he built on deceit was collapsing in real time, brick by brick, deal by deal. He sank into his chair, sweating. On his desk was another envelope. No seal, no handwriting, just one line printed in sharp ink. "Meet me where it began." Henry knew exactly where that was, the barn. That evening, as the sun set behind the fields, Eleanor stood in the same barn where 30 years ago she had helped Henry paint their first dream together. The walls were older now, the paint chipped, but the memories still breathed in every corner. When Henry arrived, he was no longer the proud man she married. His hair was disheveled, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. "What did you do?" he hissed, stepping closer. "What I should have done years ago," Eleanor replied calmly. "Tell the truth." "You destroyed everything." "No, Henry, you destroyed me. Everything else was just collateral damage." He grabbed her wrist, his grip desperate. "You think they'll love you after this? You think they'll forgive you?" She smiled faintly, tears glinting in her eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for freedom." Henry's voice broke into a bitter laugh. "You've gone mad." "Maybe," she whispered. "But madness is better than blindness." For a long moment, silence filled the space between them. Then Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the wooden box. She set it down on the table between them. "Do you know what this is?" "Your theatrics again?" He sneered. "No," she said quietly. "It's the deeds. To our land. The ones you forged. The originals. Henry froze. Eleanor continued. They're back where they belong. And soon, the law will see that too. He lunged for the box, but Eleanor stepped back. Touch it, she said coldly. And I'll make sure your mistress testifies. You know she will. She's not as loyal as you think. For the first time, Henry looked terrified. Eleanor turned away, walking toward the open door where the evening light poured in. I'm done fighting for someone who never saw me as more than a convenience. You taught me something, Henry. Love is not blind. It just pretends to be until it learns how to see. She walked out, leaving him standing there, shaking, breathless, and surrounded by ghosts of his own making. That night, Eleanor checked into a small inn by the river. She sat by the window, watching the lanterns drift across the water. Her heart ached, but it was lighter than it had been in years. Margaret entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. You did it, she said softly. Eleanor nodded. It's over. Not yet, Margaret said. He'll fight back. Eleanor's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Let him. I still have the one thing he can't touch. Margaret tilted her head. What's that? Eleanor looked out at the river again, her voice low but resolute. My peace. But peace, as it turned out, was short-lived. The next morning, a headline splashed across the newspapers. Prominent businessman, Henry Caldwell, found dead in apparent suicide. Eleanor froze. The cup slipped from her hand, shattering against the floor. The world called it tragedy. She called it consequence. But deep down, she couldn't shake the question. Had she gone too far? The rain began that morning, soft at first, then relentless, as if the sky itself mourned what had been lost. Eleanor sat by the window of her small inn-room, the morning paper trembling in her hands. The ink from the headline bled under her fingertips. Henry Caldwell, industrialist and philanthropist, dies by apparent suicide. Her eyes moved over the lines again and again, but the words never settled. Suicide, apparent. Investigation, ongoing. The world would remember him as a philanthropist, not as the man who destroyed a woman's soul. The irony made her laugh. But the sound that came out wasn't laughter. It was a tremor, half pain, half disbelief. Margaret entered quietly, holding a folded shawl. You should rest, she said softly. They'll come looking for you soon. Eleanor turned to her, eyes hollow. Do you think I killed him? Margaret hesitated. I think you broke him. There's a difference. Eleanor whispered, Sometimes I wonder if the difference even matters. 2 days later, a knock echoed through her door. When she opened it, 2 detectives stood there, sharp coats, sharp eyes. Mrs. Caldwell? Formerly, she corrected. I'm Detective Fraser. This is my partner, Detective Linwood. We're here to ask a few questions about your husband's passing. Eleanor stepped aside, letting them in. Fraser surveyed the room. Simple, clean, yet filled with faint traces of an upper-class life that couldn't be erased. Books, a pearl-handled brush, an envelope of legal documents. We understand you were separated from your husband? Yes. For how long? Long enough for him to ruin what little humanity he had left. Fraser's brows lifted slightly. That's poetic. Eleanor smirked faintly. That's experience. They exchanged glances. Then Linwood asked, Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to harm Mr. Caldwell? Eleanor looked out the window, the rain still tracing lines down the glass. Anyone who knew him, she said softly. The interrogation stretched for hours. They asked about the letter, about the forged deeds, about the business partners Henry had betrayed. But the moment that froze them both came when Fraser placed a photo on the table. "Do you recognize her?" Eleanor's eyes dropped to the picture. It was Clara Whitmore, Henry's mistress. But the photo wasn't recent. It was old, faded, taken years before Eleanor ever met her. "She's dead," Eleanor said quietly. Fraser looked up. "Are you sure?" Eleanor frowned. "Henry told me she died in an accident years ago." Fraser's tone was measured. "She didn't. In fact, she's missing." The room seemed to tilt. "Missing?" "Yes. 3 days before your husband's death." That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The words kept replaying in her head, "missing before his death." She sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the lamp, the rain still drumming against the window. If Clara wasn't dead, if Henry had lied about that too? Then everything she thought she knew was already tainted. Margaret found her pacing the floor. "You haven't eaten," she said. Eleanor turned sharply. "He lied about her. All those years. He told me she was gone. That she'd moved to France, then that she'd died. But she's here. Or was." Margaret's expression hardened. "Then maybe she's the one who finished it." Eleanor stopped. "You think she killed him?" "I think the truth rarely travels alone," Margaret said. "And neither do ghosts." The next morning, Eleanor decided to visit the Caldwell estate. It had been years since she'd stepped foot there, but something inside her whispered that the answers lay among those decaying walls. The house was unrecognizable. The once manicured gardens were overgrown, the gates rusted. She walked through the halls, her heels echoing on marble floors that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Dust covered the portraits. The air was thick with the smell of neglect and something darker, memory. She found Henry's study locked. The servant who remained, an old man named Thomas, handed her a key without a word. Inside, nothing had changed. The same desk, the same books, the same heavy curtains. Except one thing, the smell of whiskey, faint but fresh. Eleanor moved toward the desk and froze. There, lying open, was a ledger. Pages filled with handwriting that wasn't Henry's. The entries were recent. Names, dates, bank accounts. And one line written in a delicate, looping script. "Payment received, Clara." Her breath caught. There were multiple entries. The last one, dated 2 days before his death. Eleanor whispered to herself, so she was here. That night, she met with Detective Fraser at a cafe in town. The rain hadn't stopped. "I found his ledger," she said, sliding the notebook across the table. Fraser's eyes widened slightly as he flipped through it. "You shouldn't have gone back there." "Curiosity doesn't take orders," she replied. "This isn't just evidence. It's motive. For someone." Eleanor leaned forward. "You think Clara killed him?" Fraser hesitated. "We're not ruling anything out, but according to our records, Clara withdrew a large sum of money from his personal account the day before his death, then vanished." Eleanor frowned. What if she didn't vanish? Fraser looked up. Meaning? What if she was silenced? Days passed. The press grew wilder. Reporters hovered outside the inn. Some called Eleanor the widow of scandal. Others painted her as the heartbroken saint. None knew the truth, not even her. Until one night, a letter slid under her door. No return address, no signature. Just one line written in Henry's handwriting. "Meet me where the river divides." Her heart stopped. Henry was dead, but she knew that handwriting better than her own. Margaret begged her not to go. "It's a trap," she said. "Maybe," Eleanor replied, her voice steady. "But if I don't go, I'll never sleep again." At midnight, she arrived at the riverbank, the place where she and Henry once planned to build their future home. The air was cold, the fog thick. The moon broke through the clouds just enough to paint silver lines across the water. And there, Standing near the edge was a figure. "Clara," Eleanor whispered. The woman turned slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but unmistakably alive. "You shouldn't have come," Clara said. "Neither should you," Eleanor replied. Clara sighed. "He made us both prisoners. You of his lies. Me of his promises." Eleanor's voice hardened. "Did you kill him?" Clara looked away. "No, but I watched him die." The confession came in fragments. Henry had begged Clara to leave with him. He wanted to flee before his empire fell. He had wired her the money, but she refused. She was tired of being his secret. "He thought he could buy forgiveness," Clara said bitterly. "But when I told him I was going to the police, he snapped. Said he'd rather die than face ruin." Eleanor's breath hitched. "So he did it himself." Clara nodded slowly. "I tried to stop him, but he had already decided." Silence hung between them, broken only by the sound of rain against the river. "Then why hide?" Eleanor asked. Clara's voice shook. "Because they'll blame me. They'll say it was the mistress, the scandal, the greed." "No one will believe a woman who lived in the shadows." Eleanor stepped closer. "Then tell them the truth." Clara met her eyes. "You of all people should know. Truth doesn't save women like us. It just burns slower." As dawn approached, Clara turned to leave. Eleanor reached out, catching her wrist gently. "What will you do now?" Clara looked over her shoulder. "Disappear again. Some ghosts are better unseen." Eleanor watched her fade into the mist, her heart heavy with something she couldn't name. Pity, anger, sorrow, all tangled together. For the first time, she realized revenge hadn't freed her. It had only replaced her chains with silence. When Eleanor returned to her inn, Detective Fraser was waiting. "We found something," he said, handing her an envelope. "It was hidden in your husband's safe. Inside was a will, rewritten days before his death. Every asset, every property, transferred to Eleanor." She stared at the document, numb. "Why?" Fraser shrugged. "Maybe guilt, maybe love, maybe both." Eleanor whispered, "He never did anything without reason." Fraser nodded slowly. "Then maybe this is your chance to end it, to rebuild." Eleanor folded the will carefully. "No," she said, "to begin again." That night, as the rain finally stopped, she stood outside beneath a sky washed clean. No thunder, no lightning, just quiet. She closed her eyes, whispering softly, "Goodbye, Henry." The river glimmered in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed, and Eleanor turned toward it, walking into the dawn, leaving the ghosts behind. Or so she thought. The months passed quietly, too quietly. Winter came early that year, brushing frost along the windows of Eleanor's new home in the countryside. The river near her cottage was half frozen, its reflection dull beneath the pale morning sun. She'd thought distance would bring peace. It hadn't. Peace, she learned, wasn't silence. It was the absence of questions, and she still had too many. Every morning, she woke before dawn, brewed her tea, and sat by the fire reading old letters. Not Henry's, but her own. Notes she'd written and never sent. To her younger self, to the woman she had been, to the one she might become. Margaret visited often, bringing fresh bread and news from the city. "They've closed the investigation," she said one afternoon, brushing snow from her coat. "Suicide, officially." Eleanor nodded. "Officially," she repeated softly, as if the word itself was a lie. Margaret studied her. "You don't believe it, do you?" Eleanor looked into the fire. "I believe he's dead. I just don't believe the story ends there. That night she dreamt again. The same dream that had haunted her for weeks. The river, the barn, Henry's voice whispering her name. But this time there was someone else. A shadow behind him, watching. When she woke, her heart was racing. On her nightstand lay a single envelope, slid under the door while she slept. Her name written in neat black ink, Eleanor Caldwell. She tore it open. Inside was a photograph, the same riverbank where she had met Clara. But in the background, almost invisible, stood another figure. A man. Eleanor's mind raced. The photograph was recent, taken days ago. She rushed to Margaret's cottage, the letter clutched in her hand. "Look," she said breathlessly. Margaret frowned. Who could have? But before she finished, another knock came at the door. Detective Fraser stood there, coat dripping with rain. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his tone careful. "We need to talk." In his office, Fraser spread out several documents. "We's reopened the case," he said quietly. A new witness came forward. Eleanor's hands trembled. "Who?" Fraser hesitated. "A man named Edwin Hart. He worked for your husband, managed his offshore accounts." He pulled out a letter. "This was sent to us anonymously. It contains information about a transfer. Large sums moved days before Henry's death. Not to Clara. Not to you, to someone else." "Who?" Eleanor demanded. Fraser looked at her steadily. "Margaret Holloway." The world fell silent. Eleanor stared at him, unable to speak. "That's impossible," she whispered. "She's my oldest friend." Fraser slid another document toward her. "We traced it. The money went to an account under her maiden name, and the signature on the withdrawal matches." "No." Fraser's voice softened. "Sometimes betrayal comes from the ones who stand closest." Eleanor rose abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "I need to see her." Fraser reached out. "Eleanor, don't." But she was already gone. The snow was falling hard when Eleanor reached Margaret's cottage. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Everything looked peaceful, too peaceful. She pushed the door open without knocking. Margaret was there, sitting by the fireplace, her expression calm, almost as if she had been expecting her. "So," Margaret said quietly, "you found out." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Tell me it isn't true." Margaret sighed. "You always did underestimate me." Eleanor stepped closer. "You took his money. Why?" Margaret's voice was cold now. "Because I was tired of being the friend in your story, Eleanor. Tired of watching you cry over a man who deserved to burn. You got your revenge. Why couldn't I have mine?" Eleanor's eyes filled with disbelief. "Your revenge." Margaret rose slowly, her face twisting with something darker than anger, envy. "Do you know what it's like to watch someone live the life you were meant for? The house, the name, the admiration. I loved him first." The words struck like thunder. Eleanor froze. "You what?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "He courted me before you, but you were the safer choice, the perfect wife. I was the scandal he couldn't afford." It all began to make sense. The years of quiet resentment, the way Margaret had always been near, always helping. "You killed him," Eleanor whispered. Margaret's smile didn't waver. "No, dear. He killed himself. I just gave him a little encouragement." Eleanor's voice broke. "You sent that letter. You made him think the walls were closing in." Margaret's eyes gleamed. "I wanted to see how far a man could fall when the women he wronged finally stopped waiting for mercy. You used me." "I set you free," Margaret snapped. "You just don't know it yet." The fire crackled between them, throwing golden light across the room. Eleanor's tears burned as they fell. You destroyed both of us. Margaret tilted her head. No, Eleanor, I finished what you started. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched until Eleanor's voice broke it, low and steady. You may have taken his life, but you'll never have mine. She turned to leave, but Margaret's voice followed, sharp as glass. Walk away, and the truth dies with you. Stay, and we burn together. Your choice. Eleanor paused in the doorway, her silhouette framed by snow and firelight. I've already burned, she said quietly. But this time, I'll rise. And then she walked out into the storm. By morning, the cottage was gone. Firefighters found nothing but ashes. No bodies. No survivors. The papers called it an accident. Detective Fraser called it closure. But deep down, he knew. Women like Eleanor Caldwell didn't just vanish. They reinvented. Months later, in a coastal village far from the city, a woman named Elana Moore bought a small bookshop by the sea. She spoke little of her past, wore her hair differently, and carried herself with quiet grace. Sometimes at dusk, she would sit by the window, watching the waves roll in and whisper a single name into the wind. A name no one else understood. Margaret. Some nights she dreamt of the fire, other nights of the river. But most nights she simply slept, peacefully. Because for the first time in her life, Eleanor Caldwell, or whatever name she now chose to bear, owed nothing to anyone. She had buried her ghosts, and in their ashes she had found herself. The end.